Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today, we're going to be looking at something that I think we can all relate to, and that's the idea of these unpredictable seasons of life.
Yeah.
And we're going to be doing this deep dive from a little bit of a different perspective than normal. We're actually going to be looking at a sermon.
Interesting.
Now, you wouldn't think a sermon would be the first place to go to get like real deep insights, but this one is actually really fascinating, and it kind of weaves together personal experiences with biblical wisdom.
I love that weaving together the personal and the sort of timeless wisdom, I think, is such a powerful combination.
Yeah, and one of the things that the speaker does that's so cool is they really use their own life as an example.
Oh, wow.
And they talk about a time where they were hospitalized abroad.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, it was totally unexpected.
You never think that's going to happen.
Right, you're planning a trip, you're thinking about, all the fun things you're going to do, and then suddenly you find yourself in a foreign hospital, completely out of your element.
Yeah, and it really does make you realize just how quickly things can change.
Right, and the sermon even touches on how this happened, relatively recently, and how we had the COVID pandemic, and then right on the heels of that was the war in Ukraine. It's like
Back to back.
yeah, back to back. It makes you wonder, like, do we ever really feel in control,
That's the question, isn't it? Like, how do we deal with these curveballs that life seems to throw at us constantly?
Right. So I want to dig into this idea of seasons a bit more, because
Okay.
the sermon really draws on this idea of, from Ecclesiastes 3,
Oh, yeah.
a time for everything, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap, like the whole shebang.
The whole shebang. Yeah, it's a very powerful passage because it really does point to the fact that life isn't linear, right? It's cyclical.
Right.
There's going to be good times, there's going to be bad times, periods of growth, periods of loss. And one of the things I loved about this sermon is that it really emphasized accepting those things that we just can't change, even the really tough stuff like war and conflict.
Right. And so if life is this roller coaster of seasons, right, we know that there are ups and downs.
For sure.
How do we actually deal with these inevitable dips and turns?
Right.
The sermon leans pretty heavily on faith and trust in God, especially when you feel vulnerable.
Yeah.
And it even tells a story about this musician,
Okay.
Dan O'Dall. He found comfort in faith after struggling with alcoholism.
That reminds me a lot of the work of Viktor Frankl.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's a psychologist, and he actually found that even in concentration camps, the people who could find meaning in their suffering were more likely to survive.
Oh, wow.
It's not necessarily about faith per se, but it's about finding that anchor, that purpose, that thing that helps you weather those incredibly difficult times.
Right. And so speaking of difficult times, the sermon kind of contrasts this idea of material wealth with true happiness.
Well, that's interesting.
And it basically makes this argument that more possessions don't necessarily bring more joy.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, but it's hard to really internalize that sometimes.
It is, and it even calls out what it calls the silver spoon fallacy.
Oh, yeah, the idea that privilege automatically equals happiness.
Right, and the speaker uses their own experience in a less privileged region to kind of highlight how different people's needs and realities are.
It's such an important point because it really makes you think about what actually leads to a fulfilling life.
Yeah.
If it's not just about accumulating stuff, what are those core values, those intrinsic things that really contribute to genuine happiness?
Right, and that's something we could all benefit from thinking about regardless of our background.
Easily.
And kind of on that note of different backgrounds, the sermon makes a really powerful call for unity and support within the Christian community, especially in light of all the global challenges that we face.
Yeah, I love that.
It actually points to Romans 8, which says that nothing can separate us from Christ's love,
Wow.
even in the darkest times.
That idea resonates so deeply, even outside of a specifically Christian context. It really speaks to the basic human need for belonging, for empathy, and for the strength we find in community when we're facing hardship.
Right, and we've heard that time and time again, haven't we, that
Yeah.
we're stronger together.
Absolutely.
And the sermon doesn't stop at just feeling connected. It's about putting that feeling into action.
Okay.
It ends with a call to turn faith into compassionate service and to help those who are struggling.
Love it.
And it even uses the example of Matthew 25, where Jesus calls for caring for the hungry, the thirsty, the sick, and those in prison.
It's like a checklist.
Yeah.
It's so specific and direct.
Yeah.
And it made me think about a study where they found that people who volunteer their time regularly actually report feeling happier and healthier.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It seems like there's this real feedback loop between helping others and our own well-being.
So you're saying that even in those tough seasons, those times when we ourselves might feel overwhelmed,
Yeah.
there's still an opportunity to find meaning and purpose through helping others.
Exactly. And it's not about ignoring our own struggles, but maybe shifting our perspective a bit. Instead of asking, why me? Maybe we can ask, how can I help?
That is a powerful shift in thinking.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it makes me think of that saying, the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others.
I love that.
But before we get too lost in the big picture, I want to zoom back in on some specific details from the sermon.
Okay, sounds good.
What really stood out to you?
I was really struck by the speaker's description of encountering true poverty. They talked about how it challenged their own assumptions about happiness and what people truly need.
Right.
Have you ever had an experience that really shook up your worldview like that?
That's a great question. There was this one time It's like, it really changes your definition of enough, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It really does. And I think it ties back so beautifully to what we were talking about with the sermon's emphasis on compassion and service.
Right.
Because when you actually see firsthand what other people are going through, it's hard not to feel compelled to help in some way.
Yeah, and the sermon doesn't just talk about helping, in a vague sense. It actually gets really specific.
Yeah, it does.
It's like, remember that part about caring for the hungry, the thirsty, the sick, and the imprisoned?
Oh, yeah, it's like a direct call to action.
It is. It's like a checklist almost.
Totally, a checklist for how to put your faith into practice.
Right. And it's interesting because all of those acts of service are really about meeting very basic human needs.
Yeah.
Kind of things that we often take for granted.
Absolutely.
But, for someone who's struggling, those needs can feel insurmountable.
Yeah, it actually made me think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Oh, yeah.
That pyramid where the base of the pyramid is all about physiological needs like food and shelter.
Right.
And the idea is that if those needs aren't met, it's almost impossible to move on to higher level needs like belonging, self-esteem, and self-actualization.
So are you saying that by helping people meet those basic needs, we're actually empowering them to reach their full potential?
Exactly. It's like giving them the foundation to build a better life.
Wow. And the sermon kind of acknowledges the spiritual dimension of this as well.
It does.
It talks about battling for souls and fighting for the innocent.
Right. And that language might not resonate with everyone.
Sure.
But I think the underlying message is universal, which is that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what's right and to fight for justice, however we define that.
Right. And it doesn't have to be this grand heroic gesture.
No, not at all.
Sometimes the most powerful acts of service are the small, everyday things.
Totally.
Like a kind word to a stranger, a helping hand to a neighbor, a donation to a cause you believe in.
Exactly. It's about those little ripples of kindness that can have a huge impact.
I love that. And that brings to mind something that the speaker said about how even in their weakest moment, hospitalized and far from home, they found strength in their faith. Right. Have you ever experienced that kind of paradoxical strength where facing a challenge actually brought out a resilience you didn't know you had?
Oh, definitely. I remember this one time.
Yeah.
I was, like you go through something really hard and you come out the other side and you're like, wow, I didn't know I had that in me.
Totally. Yeah. And it's not just about enduring the hardship. It's about finding meaning in it.
Right.
And the sermon really leans into that with this whole idea of seasons.
Yeah.
Like how even the difficult times serve a purpose.
It's like winter, right?
Yeah.
It might seem bleak and barren, but it's actually a crucial time for rest and renewal.
Right. Setting the stage for spring.
Exactly.
For new life to burst forth.
And the sermon kind of suggests that maybe those tough times in our lives are like that too.
Yeah.
It's these periods of dormancy that ultimately lead to growth and transformation.
I love that. And what's interesting is the sermon actually offers some really practical advice on how to navigate those difficult seasons.
Yeah. Like, remember how the speaker talked about feeling completely overwhelmed and helpless?
Yeah.
I think we can all relate to that feeling at some point.
Oh, absolutely. Like you're just barely keeping your head above water.
Exactly. And the sermon really encourages us to lean into that feeling of surrender. It's not about denying the difficulty of the situation, but finding a source of strength to help us through it.
So it's not about, pretending everything's okay.
No, not at all.
but more about acknowledging like, okay, this is hard.
Right. And I need help.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 19.
Oh, yeah.
He was running for his life feeling totally defeated.
Oh.
And then God speaks to him, not in some grand spectacle, but in a gentle whisper.
That's so powerful.
It is.
It's like a reminder that sometimes those most profound insights come during those quiet, introspective times.
Totally.
Like when we step back from all the noise and chaos, that's when we can really tune in to our inner voice.
Yeah, and maybe even a sense of something bigger guiding us.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to one of the most, I don't know, paradoxical messages in the whole sermon. He is given all power in heaven and on earth.
Wow.
And this is a statement from Jesus that comes right after describing his suffering and death. So it's like highlighting this incredible truth that even in our weakest moments, we have access to this infinite well of strength and resilience.
That's so powerful.
It is, right?
So it's not about avoiding those difficult seasons, but facing them with courage and compassion and a deep trust that we're not going through them alone.
And who knows, maybe those challenging times can even become catalysts for our greatest growth and transformation.
It's like that idea that the obstacle is the way.
It is.
That every season, whether it's filled with joy or sorrow, has something valuable to teach us.
Right.
And by embracing the full spectrum of human experience, we can emerge from those difficult seasons stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected to ourselves and something larger than ourselves.
Well, I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. You know, life is unpredictable. It's full of twists and turns that we can't always control.
For sure.
But by leaning into our faith, our communities, and our own inner strength, we can navigate those challenges with grace and resilience.
Absolutely.
And just maybe those difficult seasons will even lead us to our greatest moments of growth and purpose and fulfillment.
I love that. So as you go about your week, consider this. How can you apply this wisdom of the seasons to your own life? What practices or beliefs help you weather the storms and embrace the sunshine?
Right.
And how can you use your own experiences, both the good and the bad, to grow, to learn, and to make a positive impact on the world around you?
That's a great question for all of us to ponder.
It is.
Well, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep exploring.